In a quiet neighborhood where everyone seemed to know each other, life had been mostly calm. People walked their dogs in the mornings, kids rode bikes along the streets, and the houses were neat, with well-kept lawns and gardens. But not everything was as peaceful as it seemed. Behind the curtains of some homes, there were tensions bubbling quietly, and one woman in particular had become known for stirring them. She was part of the homeowners association, a position she enjoyed because it gave her a sense of control. Neighbors often whispered about her over fences or across yards, saying she had a sharp tongue and an impatient temper, and she liked things done her way, no matter who it affected. One afternoon, the retired police officer moved into a house at the far end of the street. He had chosen this home carefully. After decades of service in the police force, he wanted a place where he could relax and enjoy a slower pace of life. His career had been challenging, filled with difficult calls and tense moments, and he hoped to leave all of that behind. He loved the quiet and the simple pleasures, like tending to a small garden and having his morning coffee on the porch while listening to the birds. He had always been respectful and kind, and he believed that living among neighbors who valued community would be a relief. From the moment he moved in, he tried to keep to himself. He greeted neighbors politely but never overstepped any boundaries. He mowed his lawn when it needed attention, watered the garden, and kept the property clean and organized. But not everyone appreciated his presence. The HOA woman in particular noticed him immediately. She had been monitoring the neighborhood, and she did not like that he had not consulted her about certain things, like the color of his front door and the placement of his mailbox. For her, it was a challenge to her authority, and she could not let it go. For days, she watched him from her window and over the fence. She noticed how he worked in his yard and how he sometimes spoke to neighbors who passed by. In her eyes, he seemed different, and that difference bothered her. She had expectations for how things should be in her neighborhood, and he did not fit them. Her frustration grew, and she began imagining problems that did not exist. She told herself that he was aggressive, that he might be dangerous, and that someone needed to take action before something happened. The HOA woman had a way of convincing herself that she was protecting the neighborhood. In reality, she was projecting her anger and fear onto the retired officer. She had been in minor disputes before, usually about small things like fence height or garden borders, but this time, she believed she had found a real threat. She started calling her colleagues at the HOA office, insisting that they needed to intervene. Her descriptions were exaggerated, filled with assumptions rather than facts. She told them that there was a man who seemed aggressive, someone who might even be carrying a weapon. Her words painted a picture of danger that did not exist, but in her mind, she was being responsible. Meanwhile, the retired officer was completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. He spent his mornings tending to the garden and reading in his living room. Occasionally, he waved to neighbors who passed by, always keeping his interactions friendly and calm. He had no interest in conflict and wanted only to enjoy his new home. But sometimes he felt a strange tension from certain neighbors, and he did not understand why. He shrugged it off, attributing it to his imagination. Little did he know, the HOA woman had already started making calls that would set a dangerous chain of events into motion. One sunny afternoon, the HOA woman decided to escalate the situation. She had been arguing over the phone with someone at the HOA office for nearly an hour, insisting that immediate action was needed. She told them that the retired officer was not just a nuisance but a serious threat. Her language was urgent and alarming. She claimed that he had been intimidating neighbors even though no one had reported any incident. Her colleagues listened politely, unsure whether to take her seriously, but she was persistent. Finally, she reached the point where she threatened to call the police herself if the HOA did not act. Her voice trembled with a mix of excitement and fear, convinced that she was about to prevent a disaster. When she made the call to the local police department, she described the retired officer as a dangerous man. She said he was acting aggressively, in his yard, watching neighbors in a suspicious way and possibly carrying a weapon. She emphasized that it was urgent, that someone needed to respond immediately. The dispatcher listened carefully, taking down all the details, and sent officers to the scene. They had no prior knowledge of the neighborhood or the people involved. All they knew was that a woman had reported a potentially armed and aggressive man. Protocol required them to respond with caution, and they arrived quickly, sirens soft but visible to everyone nearby. The retired officer noticed the police cars pulling up. He was surprised, wondering why the authorities were there. He stepped out onto his porch, keeping his hands visible, ready to cooperate. As the officers approached, they were tense, unsure what they would find. The HOA woman pointed at him, repeating her story with urgency. She gestured wildly, adding details that made him appear more threatening than he really was. Neighbors peeked from windows and doors, sensing that something unusual was happening. Some were curious, others were worried. The quiet street had suddenly become the stage for an unexpected confrontation. The retired officer remained calm, just as he had been trained to do in his career. He spoke in a measured voice, explaining that he was retired law enforcement, that he was unarmed, and that he had done nothing wrong. He answered questions honestly and kept his movements slow and deliberate. The officers, still cautious, began to sense that something was not adding up. The man in front of them seemed composed, cooperative, and non-threatening. But the HOA woman continued to insist that he was dangerous, refusing to back down. Her voice rose, demanding immediate action, and she became more aggressive in her gestures. As the situation developed, neighbors gathered quietly, some taking videos on their phones, others simply watching from a safe distance. They could see the tension in the air and the careful way the retired officer moved. He was not defensive, not hostile, just calm and methodical. The officers whispered to each other, trying to assess the situation. One of them looked at his partner, unsure if they should act or hold their position. The HOA woman's behavior was erratic, and her accusations seemed increasingly unreliable. The officers had to balance protocol, safety, and the reality they were observing, and that balance was difficult to achieve under pressure. The retired officer realized that the situation could escalate quickly if people did not calm down. He maintained eye contact with the officers, keeping his hands where they could be seen, and spoke in a clear, steady voice. He reassured them that he had no intention of causing harm and that he was willing to comply with any reasonable instructions. The officers began to lower their tension slightly, realizing that the threat might not be real. Still, they could not ignore the possibility of danger, especially with the HOA woman continuing to insist on his guilt. Time seemed to stretch as everyone waited for the next move. The retired officer's patience and training were his strongest assets, and he used them to de-escalate the situation. Neighbors whispered among themselves, some admiring his composure, others growing frustrated at the HOA woman's insistence. The scene was tense but controlled, and it was clear that the situation could go either way. The stage was set for something much bigger to happen, and no one yet realized how dramatically the day would change. The quiet street, once peaceful, had become the center of a brewing storm, and the calm of the retired officer would soon be tested in ways no one expected. The retired officer stood calmly on his porch, hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm, as the police officers cautiously approached. Their eyes scanned him, the yard, and the surroundings, searching for any sign of a weapon or hostile intent. The HOA woman pointed her finger aggressively at him, shouting that he was dangerous. Her voice carried fear, anger, and frustration all mixed together. She tried to make the situation worse, exaggerating his gestures and claiming he was threatening her in the neighborhood. Neighbors watched from windows and yards, whispering to each other. Some were worried, others skeptical of the HOA woman's claims. A few brave individuals stepped outside, keeping a safe distance, trying to observe what was really happening. Everyone could feel the tension in the air. The retired officer knew that any sudden move could escalate the situation, so he focused on staying calm and measured in his actions. He spoke softly to the officers, explaining that he was retired law enforcement and unarmed, that he had no intention of causing harm. The police officers listened carefully, their bodies tense, their hands hovering near their equipment. They had responded to the call quickly, trained to assume the worst in situations described as potentially armed threats. They could not see the retired officer's full history, and the woman's claims painted a frightening picture. Yet as they watched him, they noticed something different. He was composed, steady, and careful. He did not move quickly, did not raise his voice, and made no sudden gestures. It was clear to one officer that the threat might not be real, but their training demanded caution. The HOA woman grew more impatient. She stepped closer to the officers, trying to push them into action, waving her hands and shouting. Her accusations became louder and more frantic, claiming that he had been following neighbors and acting suspiciously for weeks. Her stories were inconsistent, but she delivered them with such urgency that the officers had to pause and consider her perspective. Her behavior drew more attention from the neighbors, many of whom were starting to question the truth. Some began filming the scene on their phones, worried that the situation could escalate dangerously. The retired officer remained calm. He knew that reacting emotionally could worsen the scenario. He continued to explain who he was, why he had moved into the neighborhood, and that he had done nothing to provoke anyone. His voice was steady, each word chosen carefully. He maintained eye contact with the officers, showing transparency and honesty. His experience as a law enforcement officer gave him a unique perspective on how to handle confrontations. He understood the need for calm, the importance of communication, and how perception could influence actions. The officers began to communicate quietly between themselves, discussing what they were seeing. One of them whispered, noticing how relaxed the retired officer's hands were, how non-threatening his posture appeared. The other officer focused on the HOA woman, who was still yelling and gesturing wildly. It became clear that she was the source of much of the tension. Her insistence that the man was dangerous contrasted sharply with his calm and open behavior. The officers realized they were in a delicate situation, balancing protocol, safety, and the reality in front of them. The retired officer moved slightly, stepping a few feet back onto the porch to create space and avoid any perception of threat. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, careful not to provoke the HOA woman or the officers. He spoke again, offering to answer any questions and promising full cooperation. He emphasized that he wanted to keep the neighborhood safe and had no desire for conflict. His words were honest and firm, projecting confidence without arrogance. The HOA woman's frustration grew. She could not understand why the officers were not immediately taking her side. She had imagined herself as the protector of the neighborhood, and now she felt her authority slipping. Her gestures became more exaggerated, pointing at the retired officer and claiming he was acting aggressively, even though everyone watching could see he was standing still, hands visible, and calm. Her insistence made some neighbors uncomfortable, while others felt sympathy for the retired officer, recognizing that he was being unfairly targeted. A few neighbors cautiously approached, trying to calm the HOA woman, but she refused to listen. She shouted that the man was dangerous, that something needed to be done immediately. The retired officer continued to speak to the officers in a calm voice, reassuring them that he posed no threat. He explained that he was a retired police officer who had spent decades handling tense situations, and that he would never act recklessly in front of law enforcement. His tone was professional, yet human, showing concern for the safety of everyone present. The police officers were caught between protocol and observation. They had arrived expecting a potential threat, but what they saw did not match the description. They could see the retired officer's hands, his steady posture, and the calm way he addressed them. Meanwhile, the HOA woman's behavior was unpredictable and erratic. The officers communicated quietly, debating whether to approach more closely or maintain a safe distance. They decided to continue speaking with him from a distance, trying to de-escalate the situation without provoking anyone further. Time passed slowly, and the tension remained high. The retired officer knew that patience was essential. He continued speaking to the officers, answering questions clearly and providing information about his identity and background. He emphasized that he had no weapon, no intention of confrontation, and that he simply wanted to enjoy his home in peace. His calmness contrasted sharply with the HOA woman's agitation, making it clear to anyone observing that he was not the source of danger. The HOA woman's frustration reached a peak. She began pacing back and forth, shouting instructions to the officers, demanding action. Her accusations became more frantic, claiming that the retired officer had been intimidating her in the neighborhood for weeks. Her stories were exaggerated, inconsistent, and designed to provoke a reaction. Despite this, the officers maintained caution, recognizing that acting impulsively could have serious consequences. Some neighbors whispered among themselves, questioning the HOA woman's credibility. Others remained silent, unsure of what to do. The retired officer continued to speak calmly, explaining that he had moved in for peace and quiet, that he had respected everyone's space, and that he had done nothing to warrant this confrontation. His words were measured, honest, and empathetic. He showed concern not only for his own safety, but also for the well-being of the officers, the HOA woman, and the neighborhood as a whole. As the minutes passed, the officers began to see the situation more clearly. They noticed the calmness of the retired officer, his willingness to cooperate, and the erratic behavior of the HOA woman. They continued to communicate quietly, discussing how to proceed without escalating the incident. The retired officer remained patient, never raising his voice, never making sudden moves, and maintaining a cooperative stance. His training and experience allowed him to navigate the tension with composure, providing a stark contrast to the chaos created by the HOA woman. The scene drew more attention from neighbors, some of whom had never seen such a confrontation in their quiet street. They watched, fascinated and concerned, as the officers assessed the situation and the retired officer calmly answered questions. Some took videos, others whispered observations, all aware that the situation could turn dangerous if handled poorly. The retired officer remained focused, knowing that any misstep could escalate tensions further. Eventually, the officers realized that the retired officer was telling the truth. His calm demeanor, cooperative attitude, and honesty made it clear that he posed no threat. The HOA woman, however, refused to back down, continuing to shout and gesticulate wildly. The officers had to navigate the challenge of separating fact from fear, truth from exaggeration, and calm from chaos. They maintained their positions, keeping a careful eye on everyone, and continued to communicate quietly about the best course of action. Through it all, the retired officer's patience and composure never wavered. He remained respectful, calm, and professional, focusing on clear communication and understanding. His decades of experience in law enforcement had taught him the importance of staying calm under pressure, and he applied that knowledge fully. The situation, while tense and potentially dangerous, was slowly moving toward resolution because of his ability to remain composed, human, and measured in his actions. While the tension lingered, another unexpected twist arrived. The HOA woman's supervisor appeared in a car, approaching the scene to try to control the situation. She had been called by the HOA woman in the office, who claimed that the retired officer was a serious threat. The supervisor arrived hurriedly, not fully aware of the scene unfolding. As she stepped out of her car, she intended to intervene and protect her employee. Her presence changed the dynamic instantly, as she approached the officers and tried to assert authority. The retired officer noticed her approach and maintained his calm stance. He understood that more people entering a tense situation could make things unpredictable. He did not make sudden movements, only keeping his hands visible and staying in a neutral posture. The officers, already on edge, now had to factor in the supervisor's presence and her movements. They were cautious, not knowing how she would interact with the officers or the man in front of them. The situation had become crowded and complicated, and every action mattered. The HOA woman, seeing her supervisor arrive, became even more frantic. She waved her hands, shouting that the retired officer was dangerous, that he had been intimidating her and the neighborhood for weeks. She wanted immediate action, and her voice rose in panic and anger. The neighbors watching felt the tension increase, some stepping back to give space, others remaining curious and cautious. The retired officer continued to speak calmly to the police, explaining who he was and emphasizing that he had done nothing wrong. He tried to maintain control of his own presence, aware that the situation was now more unpredictable. As the supervisor approached, one of the officers misinterpreted her movement. In the chaos and confusion, and with adrenaline running high, a weapon was drawn and fired. The bullet grazed the supervisor, hitting her car and causing a sudden explosion of panic. Neighbors screamed and ducked, and the HOA woman shrieked in shock. The officers froze, realizing immediately what had happened. The accidental shot transformed a tense scene into a crisis. The retired officer acted instantly, moving to ensure the supervisor was safe and attempting to control the panic that was spreading among the neighbors and the officers themselves. He approached carefully, keeping his hands visible, and called out to the injured supervisor to assess if she was conscious and alert. He checked for any immediate injuries and reassured her that help was on the way. Meanwhile, other neighbors had started calling emergency services and the street was filled with sounds of sirens approaching. The officers, stunned and shaken, tried to regain control of the situation, now facing the reality of an accidental injury. They had trained for tense scenarios, but this had unfolded in a chaotic and unpredictable way. The retired officer's experience in high-stress situations allowed him to act decisively and effectively. Even as adrenaline and fear surged around him, the HOA woman began yelling, pointing at the retired officer and blaming him for the accident. She claimed that her supervisor had been hurt because of him, even though it was clearly the result of confusion and miscommunication. Her voice was frantic, filled with fear and panic. The officers, still shaken from the accidental discharge, tried to calm everyone and secure the area. They asked the HOA woman and neighbors to move back, creating space around the injured supervisor, while paramedics were summoned to provide immediate care. The retired officer stayed calm throughout. He spoke to the officers, explaining what had happened and offering guidance on how to keep the supervisor safe until paramedics arrived. His demeanor reassured the officers, neighbors, and even the injured supervisor. Despite being unfairly targeted and falsely accused, he focused entirely on managing the crisis with professionalism, patience, and compassion. He understood that reacting with anger could make the situation worse, and he chose to remain composed, prioritizing safety and clarity. Neighbors continued to watch in disbelief. Some filmed the scene while others whispered among themselves, amazed at the calmness of the retired officer amid such chaos. They could see how the HOA woman's false accusations and erratic behavior had led to an almost tragic outcome. It was a stark contrast to the retired officer's controlled response, which prevented further harm. Many neighbors started to realize how dangerous assumptions and false claims could be, especially when fear and bias cloud judgment. The contrast between the chaotic HOA woman and the composed retired officer was clear to all who observed. The paramedics arrived quickly, moving efficiently to treat the injured supervisor. The retired officer provided them with a clear explanation of what had happened, detailing the timeline and everyone's actions. His account was precise, calm, and factual, helping the medical team understand the situation and provide the right care. The officers also began to communicate more clearly, slowly regaining their composure after the accidental discharge. The street, once filled with panic and shouting, became a controlled scene focused on ensuring the supervisor received proper attention. The HOA woman continued to protest loudly, but her voice was less compelling to the officers and neighbors who had witnessed the events unfold. Her credibility was diminished by the fact that her supervisor had been injured, and it was evident to those watching that her actions had contributed to the chaos. The retired officer, meanwhile, remained focused on de-escalation, prioritizing safety and clarity above all else. His experience, training, and composure were evident to everyone observing, further highlighting the contrast between responsible action and reckless behavior. Throughout the incident, the retired officer maintained a human-centered approach. He acknowledged the fear and panic of the HOA woman, the officers, and the neighbors, and addressed each concern calmly and respectfully. He recognized that the situation had escalated in part due to misunderstanding and fear, and he worked to clarify the facts while minimizing further risk. His behavior exemplified empathy, professionalism, and leadership under pressure, traits developed over a lifetime of service and honed through countless real-life experiences. Neighbors who had initially been on the fence began to appreciate the retired officer's integrity and composure. They realized that he had acted appropriately, putting others' safety above his own, and that the chaos was largely the result of false accusations and misjudgments. Some approached him cautiously, offering support and reassurance, while others simply observed, taking in the lessons of restraint, clarity, and calm decision-making in crisis situations. The officers, after assessing the situation and confirming the retired officer's account, began to coordinate with the paramedics and manage the scene. They provided clear instructions to the HOA woman, asking her to step back and comply with their directions. The retired officer continued to communicate with both the officers and neighbors, ensuring that everyone understood the next steps and that the focus remained on safety and proper response. His ability to remain composed, professional, and empathetic under pressure helped prevent further escalation and confusion. As the supervisor was loaded into the ambulance, she received immediate medical care for her injuries, which were fortunately not life-threatening. The retired officer continued to provide support and information, ensuring that the officers and paramedics had a clear understanding of the events leading to the incident. The neighbors, now more aware of the true dynamics, began to recognize the importance of observing facts rather than reacting to fear and assumption. The contrast between calm professionalism and reckless behavior was striking and educational for all who witnessed it. The incident left a lasting impression on everyone involved. The retired officer's ability to remain composed and empathetic in a chaotic situation demonstrated the value of experience, training, and human-centered thinking. The HOA woman, despite her intentions to assert control, had inadvertently caused panic and injury, highlighting the dangers of false accusations and impulsive actions. The officers learned a lesson in careful assessment, communication, and restraint under pressure, while neighbors gained a deeper understanding of how fear and bias can distort perception and escalate conflict. Even as the immediate crisis was resolved, the retired officer remained vigilant. He continued to speak calmly with the officers, ensuring all details were clear, and answered questions from neighbors and paramedics. His patience, composure, and professionalism continued to guide the resolution, demonstrating leadership in a real-life, high-stakes scenario. The scene, which had started as a false accusation and escalated into chaos, was ultimately stabilized because of his measured and human-centered approach. Everyone involved walked away with a greater appreciation for the importance of calm, clear, and empathetic action in moments of stress, fear, and uncertainty. After the immediate chaos had passed, the street was filled with an uneasy quiet. The ambulance had taken the supervisor to the hospital, and the officers were still coordinating their report and trying to calm the HOA woman, who was still shaking and yelling. The retired officer stood to the side, calm but vigilant, watching everything unfold. He had experienced emergencies before, but this was different. It was personal and deeply unfair. He had been falsely accused, had his life disrupted, and now a serious accident had occurred because of someone else's actions. Yet he remained composed, prioritizing safety and clarity above all else. Neighbors started to come out of their homes, curious about the incident and eager to understand what had happened. Some approached cautiously, asking questions, while others just observed silently. A few neighbors had taken videos or photos capturing the scene as it unfolded. The retired officer took the time to speak with them, explaining what had happened in simple terms and making sure no one felt unsafe. He emphasized that everyone needed to remain calm and that the situation was under control now. His clear, honest communication helped ease some of the tension in the neighborhood. The officers, after taking initial statements, began to piece together what had happened. They recognized that the retired officer had acted appropriately throughout the incident, remaining calm, cooperative, and focused on safety. The HOA woman, on the other hand, had contributed to the escalation through her false accusations and erratic behavior. It was clear to the officers that she had been the source of much of the tension and confusion. They started to address her directly, explaining the consequences of false reporting and reckless behavior. She continued to protest, but her credibility had been significantly undermined by the events of the day. Meanwhile, the retired officer reflected on the sequence of events. He understood that fear, misunderstanding, and assumptions had all played a role in what had happened. He also knew that his training and experience had allowed him to prevent a much worse outcome. His actions had helped protect the supervisor, neighbors, and even the officers themselves. Despite being unfairly targeted and falsely accused, he had remained human, composed, and professional. That combination had been critical in preventing further chaos or injury. The neighborhood slowly began to return to a sense of normalcy, but the impact of the incident was clear. People who had witnessed the events realized how quickly misunderstandings could escalate and how dangerous false accusations could be. They also saw the value of calm, measured, and empathetic responses in stressful situations. Conversations among neighbors shifted, with many discussing the incident and the retired officer's composure. Some expressed relief that no one had been seriously hurt, while others reflected on the HOA woman's behavior and how her actions had caused unnecessary panic. The officers completed their statements and began to coordinate with their department about the next steps. They recognized that while the retired officer had done nothing wrong, the HOA woman's actions could result in legal consequences. False reporting, reckless behavior, and creating a public safety hazard were all serious matters. The officers took care to document the sequence of events, including witness statements and video evidence, to ensure a fair and accurate account. The retired officer remained available to provide information, answering questions with honesty and clarity, and reinforcing his role as a responsible and professional citizen. The HOA woman was escorted to a nearby area to debrief with the officers. She was visibly shaken and confused, but she was also defensive. She continued to insist that the retired officer had caused the incident, though her claims were increasingly inconsistent and contradicted by witnesses. The officers patiently explained the facts, emphasizing that the accidental discharge had occurred due to confusion and heightened tension, not because of the retired officer. Her frustration grew, but the officers remained firm, focusing on facts and ensuring that safety and truth were prioritized over emotion. Neighbors who had remained on the street started to disperse slowly. Conversations shifted to what lessons could be learned from the incident. People discussed how important it was to avoid assumptions, to remain calm in tense situations, and to prioritize safety and clear communication. The retired officer's actions became a point of admiration for many. Even those who had not known him before realized the value of his calm, human-centered approach. He had prevented further harm and had modeled how to handle a crisis with integrity and professionalism. As the day went on, the retired officer spoke with the officers about neighborhood dynamics and the importance of clear communication between residents and law enforcement. He emphasized that misunderstandings could escalate quickly and that early intervention and calm assessment were key. The officers appreciated his insights, recognizing that his perspective as a former law enforcement professional was valuable in understanding how situations like this could be prevented in the future. His advice was practical, grounded in experience, and focused on real-world problem-solving. The HOA woman, still upset and defensive, was reminded of the potential consequences of her actions. She was informed that false reporting, reckless behavior, and inciting panic could lead to legal and professional consequences. While she remained resistant to fully acknowledging her role, the presence of multiple witnesses and the clear sequence of events made it clear that she had contributed to the chaos. The officers stressed the importance of accountability and the need for her to reflect on how her actions had affected everyone involved. The retired officer continued to interact with neighbors, offering reassurance and clarity. He made sure they understood that the immediate danger had passed and that safety protocols were being followed. His calm demeanor and clear communication helped restore a sense of order and trust in the neighborhood. People began to relax, recognizing that while the incident had been serious, it had been handled responsibly and effectively. The retired officer's professionalism had turned a potentially disastrous situation into a learning experience for the community. As the day progressed, discussions among neighbors continued, focusing on lessons about communication, assumptions, and responsible behavior. The retired officer emphasized the importance of observing facts, remaining calm, and prioritizing safety. His guidance was practical and human-centered, reflecting a deep understanding of how fear and miscommunication could escalate conflicts. Neighbors appreciated his perspective, recognizing that his actions had prevented further harm and had demonstrated the value of experience and calm judgment. The officers concluded their reports and began to depart. Having ensured that everyone was safe and that the situation was documented accurately, the retired officer remained on his property, watching as order returned to the street. He reflected on the day's events, understanding that the experience had been both challenging and instructive. He had remained true to his principles, acted responsibly, and helped prevent a potentially serious incident. His actions had reinforced the importance of calm, measured, and empathetic responses in stressful situations. The HOA woman, now left with the consequences of her actions, had a moment of reflection. Although she was still upset, the reality of the day's events was undeniable. Her false accusations and reckless behavior had contributed to panic and injury. and the presence of multiple witnesses ensured that the truth was clear. The incident served as a stark reminder of the dangers of assumptions, fear-driven actions, and the importance of responsibility and accountability in a community setting. The retired officer continued to interact with his neighbors in the following days, reinforcing trust and understanding. He shared insights about conflict resolution, communication, and safety, helping to foster a stronger sense of community. His actions had not only resolved a crisis but had also provided a valuable example for everyone involved. The neighborhood gradually returned to normal, but the lessons learned from the incident remained in the minds of residents. They understood the importance of calm, clear, and empathetic action, and they recognized the value of experience, patience, and professionalism in handling challenging situations.